households are filled with rums and whiskeys and beers, partly because that's an incredibly valuable and tradable commodity, but also it's hard to find clean water back then. So the alcohol in all these things is going to kill whatever bacteria is in there. You can drink it and stay hydrated, because this is before people are smart and realize alcohol, in fact, dehydrates you. But when the founding fathers come around, they are some of the biggest drinkers around. George Washington made sure that all of his troops at Valley Forge had at least a half a cup of rum every single day. Thomas Jefferson collected rare French and Italian wines. He also produced wines and whiskeys from the crops on his plantation. James Madison, the President of the United States. Now, obviously, first two names, also presidents, but I say it to drive home the point that he was, because old James here was rumored to drink a pint of whiskey every single day. It was not uncommon to have beer with breakfast back then, and by 1830, the average American male over the age of 15 years old was consuming 88 bottles of whiskey a year. Now, with that level of consumption comes a very special level of alcoholism. Although the Prohibition era we think of lasts from 1920 to 1933, it actually begins 100 years before that, and largely as a religious movement. All right, one of the key factors. It starts with a man named Lyman Beecher, Protestant minister and abolitionist, and he's preaching for what he calls the eradication of an evil. He views alcohol as pure evil in the United States. Now, the groups to back these ideas aren't going to largely show up until about 20 years later. Most prominently, the Washingtonians out of Baltimore, Maryland. They are a group of reformed drinkers who, oddly enough, meet inside of bars. And what they do is they get together, they swear off the alcohol, they tell each other stories about their lives as alcoholics. Kind of legitimately the first Alcoholics Anonymous. They grow to 600,000 members, which in the 1840s is a lot of people in the United States. But the laws aren't going to start to show up until about 10 years after that. Neil Dow, 1851, the mayor of Portland, Maine, successfully lobbies the Maine legislature to pass the first dry laws in America, making Maine the first dry state, notoriously heavy-handed with his application of the law. So much so that when a protest breaks out on the streets of Portland, he orders out the Maine militia, and when they show up, he simply says, "Fire into the crowd," which they do, killing several members of the protest, but effectively ending it. But the moment you make alcohol illegal in the United States is the exact moment that you have now created the first people looking to make a quick buck off the sale of this now illegal commodity. So men with flasks of alcohol in their boots start to walk up and down the streets of Portland selling swigs for $1 each, which of course gives rise to the term bootlegging or bootlegger. And obviously we have a woman there, but that perfectly illustrates what I'm talking about. Now, this is also right about the time that the women get on board, and that's the other key thing here is the women's movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony become the first women to popularly mention the idea of prohibition and temperance along with the suffrage movement. For women, alcohol is a real problem. And I'm not trying to suggest that it's alcoholism. I'm not saying women can't hold their booze as well as men. What I'm saying is before suffrage is passed, women have basically no rights. If you're married, you're kind of your husband's property, and he can treat you however the hell he wants to. Beat the crap out of you. You are not going to go to the police because the police won't have your back. In fact, you might be shunned by not just your family, but also your community for making your private problems public. There's no concept of things like marital rape at this time. And if your husband is going to treat you that way, he's the most likely to do so when he's drunk. So you can see how for women with no legal recourse at this time, this is really a huge issue. But when the Civil War breaks out, we, as I'm sure many of you are, not all of you necessarily, but drinkers get a bit of a break. It all but completely wipes the idea of prohibition from the public consciousness. And, quite frankly, people have bigger things to worry about. But more importantly, the sale of alcohol alone, at that time, we're talking about the beginning of the Civil War, so 1860s, the sale of alcohol accounts for a full 1/3 of the United States gross domestic product. Okay, they're not going to kill their largest cash cow fighting the largest war they fought since the Revolutionary War. So it's not till the idea is rekindled in the 1870s out of Ohio by a woman named Eliza Jane Thompson. We talked about the religious aspect, and so what she does is she gets together groups of women from her congregation. They go and pray outside of bars, grocery stores, apothecaries, anywhere where you're going to be able to get this intoxicating liquor. It's a shame campaign, trying to shame you as you go in, shame you as you come out. Works in some rare cases, but for the most part, these women are horribly ridiculed, shoved into the streets by the drunks coming out, doused in their beer, called every name in the book, whatever. So this movement fails, but along comes a woman by the name of Frances Elizabeth Caroline Willard. Not a failure, and probably should have been the biggest name to come out of the entire women's movement. Unfortunately, she is all too often pigeonholed into prohibition, and that's because she becomes head of something known as the WCTU, which is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. One of their biggest goals is temperance and prohibition. And there is a slight difference. You're going to hear me saying both words. Temperance, it's in the wording, right? Temperance, the tempering, let's back it off. Prohibition, it's done. A lot of these women are also former school teachers, and so what they start to do is push for prohibition to be taught in the schools as a curriculum. Women like Mary Hatchet Hunt take literature produced by the WCTU, they go directly to school boards and demand that it be put into the curriculum. They become so powerful and influential at doing this that in a lot of school boards across the country, you can't get a book into a health class without the personal sign-off of Mary Hatchet Hunt and the WCTU. So doctors that want to get real info into a class can't do so without putting in some kind of nonsense about prohibition, and it is largely nonsense. Things like 1 sip of alcohol will start to wear away the lining of your esophagus. 1 sip of alcohol, and you are hooked. You are down the path to total drunkenness. Cheers, everybody. I guess I'm hooked. Anyway, despite the fact that they are a Prohibition era-based group and movement, you can still join the WCTU today. They are based of where they have always been based out of, Evanston, Illinois. And you can sign up as early as 6 years old. And in fact, I'm not sure how it's appearing on your screen, but on my screen, on the left, the greenhouse is Frances Willard's home, and on the right is still the head of the headquarters of the WCTU. And you can sign up as early as 6 years old, because what they understand today, as much as they understood back then, you want to get the next group of people to back your movement, you have to go after kids. You got to get that new generation, all right? And if I'm a 6-year-old in the late 1800s without the ability to go to a good public library or even jump on the internet and find out that a lot of what I'm being told is nonsense, it's going to scare the crap out of me. All right. Although that being said, I did go to 12 years of Catholic school. Speaking of the Western suburbs, a graduate of Montini Catholic. And throughout my life, I've been told all kinds of stuff I shouldn't do that I still do. And the point is that this new generation is learning the ideas of prohibition. But even with that, alcohol's still huge business.
Jonathan, real fast,
yeah.
Could you speak up just a smidge? A couple of our participants are having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
Absolutely. If I get a little bit closer to the microphone, is that helping at all?
I think so. I'll let you know.
Okay, sure.
Perfect.
I'll just stay really close. Absolutely. I'll just make out with the microphone here for the rest of the thing so that everyone can hear. And if you can't hear, please just let me know again. But anyway, so basically you have this new generation learning the ideas of prohibition. But even with that, alcohol is still huge business because at the turn of the century, there are now 300,000 saloons across the United States, and now they're not just places to get a drink. Meeting halls for veterans groups, unions, polling places. They're voting for the president inside of bars. For a woman named Carrie Nation, this becomes all too much to deal with. Carrie Nation is a good-hearted person. She's decent. She has lost people to alcoholism, but she's also a little bit crazy. She gets her start by kneeling in prayer one day when she hears the actual voice of God himself from on high come down and say, "Go to Kiowa," which is a small town in Kansas. So she gets up off her knees. She gets on a train to go to Kiowa. No plan as to what she's going to do when she gets there. She shows up, she sees the first saloon off the train, and here's her big move. She grabs some rock and some pipe. She walks into the saloon and then just starts smashing the place apart. Throws the rock through the glasses and bottles and mirrors behind the bar. It takes the pipe, smashes all the glasses and bottles from off the bar. Then starts to move from saloon to saloon doing this. Eventually town to town and saloon to saloon doing this, adopting a hatchet at one point and referring to these as hatchetations. In one town, in one day alone, she's arrested and released 4 separate times. I know what you may be thinking. Why do you keep letting her go? Well, Kansas had dry laws on the books at this point, so a lot of these places that she's smashing up are technically illegal. They can't go to the police. The other thing is a lot of times people will say, why don't you just grab her and toss her ass out of there? Well, a couple of things. First, Carrie Nation is 6'1", all right, at a time where your average male is about 5'9", 5'10". She's not slightly built. She's dressed all in black, and she's running at you with a hatchet. That is a formidable figure and maybe someone you don't want to get in the way of. She's a fanatic. She's viewed as a fanatic, and she actually becomes a big point of ridicule to the point where bars start to put up signs that say, all nations welcome except Carrie. What she doesn't understand, and quite frankly the women are not yet capable of, is if you want to get something done in America, you don't smash up a saloon, you don't pray outside of a grocery store. If you want to get legislation passed, you have to go after legislators. So this is what I call, oh, this asshole. This is where a group called the Antisaloon League comes into play. It's founded in Oberlin, Ohio by the Reverend Howard Hyde Russell. Now, Howard Hyde Russell, decent guy, he creates his organization to fully go after Prohibition. And in charge of his group, he puts Wayne Bidwell Wheeler. And that is probably the single most influential person in getting Prohibition passed in America. And this is the gentleman that I'm referring to with that headline. The reason I treat him like this is because he is all about Prohibition, and he is not interested in listening to anyone else but himself, including the women, because you cannot be a woman and be a member of the Anti-Saloon League. And so what he starts to do is go to politicians and basically say, listen, you're going to vote the way I want you to vote, or we will find someone who will. And we have the money, power, and influence to get that person into office. And he realizes that wet politicians can be worked with. And wet's obviously the people that want to drink. And he can go to them and basically say, look, it's Prohibition. It's probably never going to happen. So you can vote for my little initiative. I'm happy. My people are happy. You get to keep your seat in office. Everything's fine. Because that's any politician's number one fear, is losing their seat. And so now even these politicians are starting to vote for Prohibition. But even with that, alcohol's still huge business. And that brings us to our next thing, is at the turn of the century, two big things happen. First, there's a switch from rural to urban. People start to move into the big cities, and far more importantly, massive influx of immigrants into the United States. And these are Irish, Italian, German, Polish, Czech. Well, what do all of these cultures have in common, right? Especially the Germans. And the Germans are bringing it with them. Men like Miller, Blatz, Pabst, Schlitz, and the king of beers, Adolphus Busch, start to bring their product out. And Adolphus builds the largest brewery in the Western Hemisphere. Self-contained, everything he needs to make business boom, and it's booming. He's so well known and highly regarded that on the night of his 35th wedding anniversary, there's a toast held in his honor nationwide. Because the brewers actually owned the saloons back then. It's illegal to do that now for monopoly purposes, but the brewers never understood Prohibition. First, they didn't understand it because they didn't see themselves as a problem. We're giving you beer, it's liquid bread, you have it with breakfast. The other thing is that at that time, the federal government of the United States was making, in some cases, upwards of 40%, 40% of their annual income off of beer taxes alone. You can't get rid of us. You need us. Well, in 1913, the unthinkable happened for the brewers when the federal income tax law was passed, and suddenly the United States government has a brand new piggy bank from which to withdraw funds. They don't need the big brewers anymore. It's nice, we'll take it, but we don't need it. The brewers lose their monetary influence. And so doubling down, groups like the ASL, the WCTU, there's a march held on December 10th in Washington for Prohibition, demanding a federal amendment to the Constitution. It's introduced that same day in both houses of Congress, January 10th of 1913, and it'll be passed within 5 years, at which point the brewers had been totally knocked out of the box. When the United States entered World War I against Germany, suddenly they become very unpopular in the United States. Wayne Bidwell Wheeler, in fact, convinces Congress to pass a temporary ban on the sale of grain to the brewers for the war effort. He also convinces Congress to open up investigations into them as spies for the German Kaiser. They're done. They're knocked out. This thing looks like it might happen. And it has to happen before 1920 because a new census was going to come out that would reflect the two things we talked about, and most importantly, the influx of immigrants. And when they were counted, they were going to have a voice, and then the dries would be outmatched. And so the wets finally see the writing on the timeline, or writing on the wall, rather. They propose a timeline. You need 36 states to get this done. Go find them. You got 84 months to get it done. 7 years. Seems like a long time, right? Well, they just vastly underestimated their competition. First, it's going to eclipse that 20 mark, and then once the census comes out, it's effectively dead. But as I said, they just don't see it. It took the Dries 13 months to find the 36 states needed. In just over a year, Nebraska became the 36th state to ratify Prohibition to the Constitution on January 16th of 1919, and the law would go into effect 1 year later on January 17th of 1920, which, by the way, January 17th of 1920 just so happened to be Al Capone's 21st birthday. Prohibition began on Capone's 21st. Now, there were no drinking age restrictions back then. Still a fun little fact. Speaking of the gangsters, this is what gives rise to them. Okay, if it weren't for Prohibition, we probably would have never heard of any of these names, certainly not outside of Chicago. So the three factions I want to discuss. First, the Sicilians, originally run by the Jenna brothers, 6 of them in total. Then there's the Northsiders. The Northsiders are an amalgamation of Irish, Jewish, Polish, and Italian gangsters, originally run by Dean O'Banion, Jaime Weiss, Bugs Moran, and Vincent Drucci. And then, of course, we have the Italians, also from the South Side, originally run by Big Jim Colosimo, then Johnny Torrio, and then, of course, Big Al Capone. Now, when Prohibition begins, they actually work kind of closely with each other, particularly the Northsiders and the Italians. There's this kind of fragile truce that is holding everything together. Now, when Prohibition begins, Big Jim actually wants nothing to do with it. He already has an illegal liquor trade, but far more importantly, an incredibly valuable prostitution and gambling ring. He does not want the extra attention that's going to come along with Prohibition. But Johnny Torrio sees the vast amounts of money that are going to be made, and he tries to convince Big Jim anytime Big Jim is willing to listen, but Big Jim always says no, to the point that Torrio knows if he's ever going to get the Italians on board, he's going to have to take out Big Jim. Now, originally, Torrio was from Brooklyn, and so what he does is contact an old Brooklyn buddy of his named Frankie Yale. Frankie Yale is dispatched to Chicago with one purpose: to get rid of Big Jim, which he is successful at doing, along with the help of Torrio's then second-in-command, Big Al. With Big Jim gone, Torrio takes over complete control of the Italians. Now, as I said, for Torrio, plenty of money to go around, and he's willing to work with both the Northsiders and the Sicilians. But those two groups absolutely despise each other. Dean O'Banion will tell anyone who is willing to listen how much he hates the Sicilians, including using racial slurs against them, and one day he decides he's done playing nice with everybody. He double-crosses Johnny Torrio. The two men were shareholders of the Sebens Brewery up on the north side. And what O'Banion does is he tells Torrio that he's essentially afraid of the Sicilians and he wants out. $500,000, Torrio can buy him out. That's a huge amount of money in the 1920s, but Torrio basically says, all right, set up the deal. What Torrio did not know was that O'Banion had been tipped off by his Chicago Police Department contacts that the Sebens was about to be raided. And so he sets up the day of the meeting for the day of the raid. The two men show up, they exchange the money, then the police department descends and arrests everybody involved. Now, why would O'Banion allow himself to be arrested? A couple of reasons. First, he won't look like the snitch. Second, more importantly, he's a first-time offender. For him, it's a slap on the wrist. He's going to pay it. He's going to go his way. Now, for Torrio, he's going to do prison time. And that's exactly what happens. O'Banion pays the fine, and about a year later, Torrio ends up in prison. So in a fit of rage, he takes the reins not only off his own guys, but also the Sicilians. And so what they do is very cunning. So I jumped ahead in this slide, but give you an idea who O'Banion was. He was florist by trade. That's his flower shop. He was directly across the street from Holy Name Cathedral. And it's rumored that he took great pleasure in making the funeral floral arrangements for the men that he had either ordered killed or had personally killed himself. So O'Banion will murder you and then send flowers to the funeral. And the joke was, the bigger the flower arrangement, the more he hated whoever that person was. So, real nice guy. Anyway, what the Jennas do is they contract our old friend Frankie Yale to go into the flower shop. Now, the two men probably knew each other, certainly of each other, and one day Frankie Yale walks in with two members of the Jenna gang that O'Banion does not recognize, and when the two men shake hands, the two members of the Jenna gang pull out pistols and shoot O'Banion down in his own shop. With him gone, Jaime Weiss takes over leadership of the Northsiders. This is a problem for everyone. Jaime Weiss is a psychopath. He's incredibly reckless. He has always hated the Sicilians and the Italians. He's referred to as the only man Capone ever feared, and he declares all-out war on the Italians and the Sicilians, or the Sicilians and the Italians in this case. And this is what starts off what's known as the Beer Wars, which will go from 24 almost throughout the duration of Prohibition. Now, what ends up happening is both Jaime Weiss, and now Bugs Moran, his second in command, they start to actively go after Johnny Torrio, and they are successful at getting to him when they ambush him outside of his South Loop home, bum rush him from 2 different directions, firing the entire way. Torrio's hit 5 times, but he then survives. He convalesces in prison, goes to Italy before he ends up back in New York, one of the rare gangsters that just say, screw this, and he retires. And that leaves Capone in complete control of the Italians on the south side. Now, Capone knows he has to go after the Sicilians, or after the Northsiders rather, but he never really trusted the Sicilians either. And so independently of one another, both the Italians and the Northsiders start to systematically wipe out the Sicilians. They are effectively neutralized when 4 of the 6 Jenna brothers get into a gun battle with the Chicago Police Department and are killed. With them gone, Capone turns his full attention to the Northsiders, setting up a couple of guys in an apartment near the flower shop. Despite the fact that O'Banion was gone, flower shop's still the heart of the Northside operation, and what they do is they're tracking the comings and goings of the Northsiders. And when they're ready to make their move, what ends up happening is a car pulls up on the south side of Holy Name Cathedral. Jaime Weiss, Bugs Moran, and Vincent Drucci get out. When they go to cross the street, all hell breaks loose. There's an all-out gun battle in the middle of State Street. And when I say all-out gun battle, Holy Name Cathedral was hit 35 times by gunfire. You guys have probably heard the rumors of the bullet holes in the side of Holy Name. They try to downplay that for obvious reasons, but Jaime Weiss is killed on the sidewalk right in front of the church. With Weiss gone, Moran then assumes complete control of the Northsiders. Now, Capone, for his part, is trying to broker some level of truce with Moran. He has always been trying to, but Moran refuses to get on board, and he also is starting to hijack Big Al's liquor shipments. And so Al finally decides he's had enough, and he calls a meeting where he basically has the Northsiders tipped off to a liquor shipment up on the north side at a garage. He has one of his guys tell the Northsiders that a liquor distribution is going to be made, and he is going to take it over. Or if you want to take it, this is where we're going to be. 6 members of the Moran gang showed up to that meeting. Moran himself is supposed to be there, stops on his way to get a haircut. That haircut saves his life, because once the 6 members of the gang are inside, a car pulls up, 4 men jump out, 2 dressed in street clothes, 2 dressed as Chicago police officers. They go inside the building, line 7 men up against the wall, and they gun them down in cold blood using Thompson submachine guns, also known as Tommy guns, or as they're known here in Chicago, the Chicago typewriter or the Chicago organ grinder. And basically, Capone takes full control over the entire city. Now, this is a midday broad daylight shooting, so the 2 guys in street clothes put up their hands. The 2 guys dressed as police officers follow them out with guns drawn, and nobody says anything about it until several hours later, when the crime is discovered. And once it is, it hits the cover of every major newspaper in America, prompting one columnist to write that today Chicago gangsters graduated from murder to massacre. And if you take a look at the dates on here, you have February 15th and February 16th, because of course this is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and that consolidates Capone's control over the entire city of Chicago. But this is also a rallying cry against Prohibition. People are tired of it. This is 1929 at this point. And so what ends up happening is the whole country looks at this and says, if this is the best that Prohibition has to offer, it's too much. Look at the violence it's created. Even the gangsters are looking at themselves and saying, this is too far, it's too much. And Luciano in New York creates the 5 Families of New York, the first crime commission, and basically lets everybody know that you want to do anything like this ever again, you got to clear it with New York first. So now, not only has Prohibition not stopped or prevented crime, it's created and perfected organized crime in America. And then the Depression happens, and people are saying, open the breweries and the distilleries. You're going to put thousands of people back to work. But this is all falling on deaf ears. And so now we have this full circle thing happen where the women start to revolt, okay? To prominence comes a woman by the name of Pauline Sabin. Pauline Sabin, originally from Chicago, becomes a wealthy New York socialite. She's always been on the side of Prohibition. She's always been a Republican, but she's starting to have some big problems with the things that she's seeing. First, She hates all the hypocrisy of it. She sees these Republican and Democratic senators and representatives making these impassioned speeches for prohibition during the day, then showing up at one of her parties at night looking for a drink. Her far bigger problem is the head of the WCTU at that point is a woman by the name of Ella Boole. And Ella Boole claims to speak for all women everywhere. Now, in my almost 41 years on this planet, I have yet to figure out what one woman wants, let alone every woman everywhere wants. And that's not a knock on women. That's on me. I'm just saying it's a bad stance, really bad stance to take to say that you speak for all women everywhere. And what she says is, oh, honey, no, you don't speak for me. You don't know what I want. You don't know what my friends want. And so finally fed up with these things, she does 3 things herself, the most important of which is found the National Organization for Prohibition Reform. And that prompts one senator to say, if the women are on board, this thing has a chance for repeal. Maybe the greatest unintended consequence of prohibition is that prohibition is passed as the 18th Amendment. The 19th Amendment is suffrage, women's right to vote. And so women are newly liberated. There's also a sexual revolution that happens in the 20s. The flapper becomes the fashion icon of the time period. All right? Women like Mae West and Josephine Baker not only become icons of entertainment, but sex and femininity and the flapper in general. And so now women want to be able to come out and have a drink just like everybody else. And for the first time, the speakeasies are looking at women and saying, absolutely, get in here, bring your friends, 100%. So there is this huge change where this whole generation of women has now grown up inside the speakeasy. They've learned how to drink just like the boys. They want to keep doing it, and then if they can do it legally, they are 100% on board. Now, the other big thing that happens because of the speakeasies is the entertainment value of things, okay? Not only, burlesque has been around for a long time. It's become super popular now because the mores of the time have changed with the sexual revolution and everything else. But there's also something else taking over America in the 20s. Jazz becomes the sound of the age. Obviously, you've heard it referred to as the jazz age. And the speakeasies cashing in on this bring up the best jazz musicians of the time period. People like, there we go. People like Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, Cab Calloway, Bessie Smith, Duke Ellington. They start to bring their sound from the South up into these northern speakeasies. Now, there's something that I want to touch on here, is that what you end up seeing is this very mild integration happening in America. I don't want to oversell that, because the reality is that even in the northern states, Chicago, wherever, if you were African American, to get into a lot of these places, including the Cotton Club in Harlem, the only way you could have gotten in as an African American was as entertainment, was as the help, the service. But what it does do is it exposes white America to jazz and the African American sound that is coming out of the South. And so what you end up having throughout Prohibition is 2 big things. First, women welcomed into the bar, which I gotta tell you, in my lifetime, I am thrilled by. I would much rather be in a bar that's filled with women than I would be in a bar that is just men. Although, that being said, I'm sort of loosely referred to as a bear in the gay community, and it is a lot of free drinks and flattery. I highly recommend it. I went to theater school. I love going to Boys Town, so actually for me, I guess it's not that big of a deal. But the point is that you have this blending of genders and cultures and all these things that probably the people that fought for Prohibition would have been horrified by, okay? Despite the fact that they were the progressives of the time period, a lot of them didn't have real progressive thoughts on race, and so, or gender for that matter. And so the idea that the genders are mixing and the races are mixing would have been horrifying to them, but that is obviously a huge plus for us 100 years later, is that we have these blending of cultures. And so the last thing to really touch on is, did Prohibition work? And I don't know what happened to that slide. I guess I messed it up there. But So here we have a graph that I want to show you. So here we have drinking habits before Prohibition. You see down in 1920 here, you have this massive dip. Okay, but what you do see is you see almost a sharp rise immediately in the first couple years, but then a leveling off, drunkenness arrests. You have this line, which is alcoholic psychosis, so delirium tremens, and basically people getting too drunk and going crazy. Cirrhosis deaths of the liver, not just cirrhosis in general, but deaths in general. And then as we get towards the 50s, the alcohol consumption starts to approach old levels. But what I do want to point out is you see how this levels off, and this levels off, and this levels off. But look at this here. Alcoholism deaths. If consumption stays essentially level, and all these other conditions stay essentially level, why is it that alcoholism deaths skyrocket? That's because a lot of this booze is not real good, okay? Unless you are getting it from someone who has a name that they are trying to uphold, you got to be real careful, because a lot of this booze is being cut by things like methanol and paint thinner. You drink it, you might go blind. It may in fact kill you. In fact, the government put out several batches of poisoned alcohol. The idea being that people would get sick, they would stop drinking. Now, I know that probably not all of you drink that much. Maybe some of you don't drink at all, but I bet you a lot of you do, and I'm almost willing to guarantee that everyone on this Zoom has thrown up from one point or another from too much drinking. That's not a judgment. Guilty as charged. It's a fact. So all the government did was kill and hurt people. And so you see this here where they actually tried to go after the government for literally killing people throughout Prohibition. And it's only in the 1980s where you start to see a precipitous drop in drinking. It continues to increase and increase and increase up until the 70s. And then you start to get really common sense laws like the national 21 and over drinking age. You start to hold bars accountable for over serving people. You start to regulate what can be put into alcohol. And then you start to see a drop in the alcoholism rates throughout the 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s, and really throughout most of the 2000s until the last 5 years or so. Starting in 2017, you start to see a rise in alcoholism and alcohol consumption and everything else. And I probably don't have to tell anyone this, but because of the pandemic of the last 2 years, alcohol has really gone through the roof, okay? The bars and the restaurants have been hurt, no doubt. But talk to any representative who works for any alcohol company, and they will tell you their sales have almost never been higher. Because people, sadly, to deal with a lot of the stress of the last couple of years, have started to drink by themselves at home to help cope with a lot of these things. And again, I'm not making any kind of judgments on anyone, just reporting the facts. So we are starting to see an increase once again in consumption and alcohol rates and alcoholism rates and things of that nature. Now, I know that I've probably skipped some things that you guys are interested in, but I just, obviously gave you almost 200 years at this point of history. So I would love to open it up to questions and anything that we may have as far as that goes. And then we can also talk about just cocktailing in general and in my bar background. Whatever you guys got, I'm here for you.
Let me tell you, Jonathan, that was amazing. What a ride. But also out the gate, just there were like questions. You barely started and people were like, I already have the things. But one of our guests, it was a great observation. And what we were tying up with is that they have a part-time job as a cashier at a liquor store, and that their sales have been up 40% plus since this pandemic had hit.
Yep.
So some of the questions right out the gate were actually more about you and your business. So I definitely, while people, are probably marinating and have other questions they'd like to add, knock these out real fast. The first one was, because we do have some teachers with us tonight for professional development. Thank you guys so much for joining us, teachers that are on this call with us. But one of them want to know if you go to schools and do guest speaking on Prohibition for students.
I have done that. I certainly can do that. I will clean it up. This was actually the cleaned up version, believe it or not. But yes, I certainly can do that. Absolutely.
Clean. Now I want to see what the normal version is.
Well, it's a 21 and over drinking tour, so there's some F-bombs and some other stuff. I was keeping it pretty chill for this evening.
The next question was, how do I take a Prohibition tour?
Well, it's really simple. Let me throw my last slide at you here. You go to prohibitiontours.com, and right now, due to staffing issues post COVID lockdown, we only have the walking tour available, but it is a really good tour. People seem to really enjoy it. And the plus side to not having staff is you get me on every tour. So the owner, the writer, the researcher, the person who has done all the work to make this happen will be your tour guide. So.
And then quick follow-up question. If you can do schools, how would our lovely teachers in the audience get a hold of you?
I believe it's on our email address is on the website, but what you can do is write just an email. You can send it to me personally, jonathan.notek. My last name is Knotek, so that's jonathan.notek@gmail.com. Get in touch with me through there, and I'll be happy to work with you and set something up.
And then the other awesome question, and it was one right out the gate. What is it that you were drinking tonight?
Oh, well, do I have it? Yep, let me just reach for it here. I have a very special bottle of Eagle Rare. Eagle Rare comes out of the Buffalo Trace distillery. This is one of their high-end bottles. And more importantly, this bottle was given to me from a friend. This is a single barrel specifically chosen for a specific bar. It's a 10-year-old that I got some time ago, and I only pull this out for very special occasions. So I decided to have that tonight.
Alrighty, so now into some of the history questions. How did large breweries survive? Oh, can you please put his email on? Yes. Someone just asked if I could put your email on the chat, which I could totally do for you, right?
Yes, you can do that. You can do the one that I gave you. You can also do the one that you and I have been corresponding with, which I'm blanking on what it is for the moment.
I believe it's Chicago Prohibition Tours at gmail.com.
That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, you can put that one up there and give them to that, or my personal one, either one. Yeah.
Perfect. So I'll get that for you, Amy. You were the one who asked. While Jonathan answers this question, how did large breweries survive during Prohibition?
Well, first of all, a lot of them did continue to make beer. Also, what you have is a lot of the bigger breweries. So we talked about Adolphus Busch and Miller and Pabst and stuff like that. A lot of them owned their own farms. Okay, and so what they were able to do was, instead of making grain for alcohol, they were able to switch to make grain for feed. And they would provide that to farmers for their animals and things like that. You also have a lot of brewers make things like root beer. So there's a couple of different ways that they pivot. Unfortunately, the smaller people did in a lot of times fail. But I do know that Leinenkugel's, way up in northern Wisconsin, Leinenkugel's got busted at least one time for continuing to produce beer. If they're doing it, you gotta believe that the big guys were doing it too. So there's kind of multiple ways to get past it.
I never knew that Leinenkugel's had been around that long. To me, that's...
Yeah, they've been around for a long time, and they actually have. I probably shouldn't plug whatever, but their brewery tour is actually really good. I highly recommend, if you guys are ever up there, please do it.
Then somebody asked if there were any women profiteers.
Yes and no. Most of the women that would have profited from this would have been because they were the wives of gangsters or the bootleggers. And there is a difference, to just really quickly say. Bootleggers are guys that can either produce or get you the booze en masse, whereas the gangsters are really more like distributors. So that's really the way that women would have profited during the time period. Very few of them, or at least in my research, and if anybody knows a story, please, I'm willing to hear it. But I don't know of any women that specifically profited from running it themselves. I do know that women like Annette Caravetta, who was married to Frank Nitti, who took over from Capone, did benefit off of it, became a very formidable figure herself. But most of the women that would have profited from Prohibition would have done so via the brothels as madams.
Interesting. Alrighty. Somebody had asked, was alcohol content less back then?
Leading up to Prohibition, no. During Prohibition, also no. But interestingly enough, when FDR runs for the presidency, and he's obviously the one that sees the end to Prohibition, part of his campaign was running on 3.2% alcohol. And the reason for that is the very legal letter of the law said that what was illegal was to manufacture, sell, or transport intoxicating liquor. Okay, and to that point, it was never illegal to own or consume alcohol during Prohibition. Okay, so places like the Yale Club in New York City, seeing the coming of Prohibition, bought so much alcohol that it lasted them the entire 13 years of Prohibition. And I know, Chris, that you have a fact about McCormick, if you want to throw that in as well.
Oh yeah, sure. Colonel McCormick's brother was Senator Joseph Medill McCormick. And because his brother was in politics, his brother had gotten wind that Prohibition was coming and it was going to be illegal to purchase alcohol. And Colonel McCormick was like, buy it all. We got to get all of them. We got to put it in the basement of Cantini.
Right. Exactly. So there's alcohol out there. You can get it. And then there's also things like medicinal alcohol, okay, that continues to be produced because a lot of medicines were alcohol-based back then. There's industrial applications for alcohol. So they're still producing alcohol, and you can still get your hands on it largely. But in terms of its alcoholic ABV, it pretty much stays the same throughout Prohibition, if not stronger during Prohibition. It's after Prohibition that we see the huge drops in alcohol level, and that is because when FDR proposes the lifting on the 3.2, it technically flies under the law of alcoholic liquor, and so it's a way to ease people back into drinking. And incidentally, that is why American macro brews are so low in alcohol content. It's only been within the rise of the craft brewery that we're seeing the bigger alcohol contents.
Nice. Somebody asked, is it true that the Kennedy family had been heavily involved in bootlegging?
Yeah. Yeah, Joe Kennedy. And now here's the thing. It depends on what source you go to for this information. The sort of prevailing wisdom is that Joe Kennedy was the whiskey baron of New England. And that is how he made a lot of his original money, was through bootlegging, and then heavily invested that money in the stock market, and then also played the stock market pre-depression, to then increase his wealth as well. But yeah, that initial capital does come from bootlegging.
Oh gosh, all of a sudden there's 1,000 more questions that are not on my pre-organized sheet. How would somebody find out about a location of a speakeasy during Prohibition?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I was actually thinking about that when we were talking about it, because I didn't really get a chance, because I really wanted to talk about the cultural aspects as opposed to the speakeasy itself. But they weren't hard to find, okay? New York City alone had an estimated 30,000 to 100,000 speakeasies. And Chicago couldn't have been that far behind. To put that into perspective, Chicago currently has around 2,000 legal liquor licenses. So there were multitudes of places that you could go to get a drink. And in fact, there's a joke that comes out of the Templeton, Iowa area. So Templeton Rye whiskey now comes out of there. They call it the good stuff on the bottle because supposedly that is where Capone got his favorite whiskey from, was that area. And the joke was, if you went to that area and asked, I'm looking for the good stuff, they would say, okay, see that building with the red door? That's a church. Don't go there. In other words, pick a door. You know what I mean? So it really wasn't that hidden. And then you have things like a brothel has a red light out front. So I'm told. A speakeasy has a green light out front, a green door, a green piece of stained glass, something along those lines. So the bottom line is everyone knew where you could go to get a drink, but there were subtle clues like the green light or whatever.
Can you describe the relationship between political corruption and prohibition in Chicago and nationally, and the extent to which the related problems it caused continued after repeal?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a really in-depth question. I'll try to answer it as succinctly and quickly as I can, but the amounts of money that these gangsters are making are astronomical. At its height, the Capone organization was making $105 million a year. That's in the 1920s. Today, that is a billion-dollar corporation. To that point, they were so good at money management and moved so much of it that, believe it or not, Harvard University used to teach a course on money management based on the Capone organization. Okay, so they have a lot of money to throw around, and what they're doing is they're paying off aldermen, mayors, police chiefs, police officers, whatever. And especially towards the end of Prohibition, when we get into the Depression era, anyone's trying to make a little extra money. I want to say this for the record. I hold no judgment on anyone who was a bootlegger during Prohibition. In fact, based on what I now know, you bet your ass I would have been a bootlegger during Prohibition. With that much money to be made and the very low penalties that had to be paid. And so what essentially ends up happening is these guys essentially buy their way into politics. And by the time that Prohibition is over, some of them have become the mayors and the aldermen and the judges or whatever the case may be. So, and then they start to do things like union corruption, which most of us have heard about throughout our lifetimes, and things like that. For example, Frank Nitti made himself the head of the bartenders union. And so after Prohibition ended, he would basically extort bars and say, you are going to use my bartenders or you will not get the booze that I control. And so there's that kind of corruption as well. So it just kind of carries on. And then, so in terms of its impact today, it's just transferred into other things. Obviously, today now, the modern prohibition is drugs. I don't, listen, whatever your viewpoint is on drugs is totally fine. I don't care. But the marijuana laws that we're seeing today are basically based on what came out of Prohibition. And so, you know, the states are kind of slowly trying to figure it out. And then once the federal government figures out how to make the money, it will be legal nationwide. It's just a matter of time. And then in 100 years from now, we will talk about the gang wars over marijuana, just like we're talking about the gang wars over Prohibition.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about Carrie Nation?
I mean, I can. I don't know if that person wants me to go into a specific thing.
Well, they said, do you know more about Carrie Nation? I reworded a little bit, assuming they wanted some information. So they just might want to know if you, like, in general, because this is the person who was asking about you speaking for students. So I'm assuming maybe they want to know more Carrie Nation in terms of that.
Sure. I mean, Carrie Nation is, you know, I feel bad calling her crazy. Although I'm sorry, I do view anyone whose tactics are going into a place and just smashing it up with a hatchet as a little bit off. But there's a reason for that, and that is because Carrie Nation lost multiple people to alcoholism. I believe a son, a brother, I think her father, possibly a husband, several people. And so it affects her very strongly. And so she obviously has a very strong feel towards it, and you see that to be the case with a lot of these people that are fighting for prohibition. Is it's because they've lost people to alcoholism. So Carrie Nation, you know, learns the hard way the evils of alcohol, particularly unchecked alcoholism, and so that's what kind of fuels her, and she becomes this formidable figure in terms of being kind of frightening and imposing, but also even the WCT, and she's a member of the WCTU, they kind of don't want her associated with them. Frances Willard holds her at arm's length. They're kind of not really approving of her methods. She has an organization herself, which is headquartered out of Ohio, and I don't remember what its specific name is. But yeah, she does become one of the loudest names. But sadly, because of her antics, and I hate to say it that way, but it's true, because of those things, she really becomes more of a point of ridicule than an effective agent for change. And then once Prohibition is passed, you know, she kind of takes it as a win, and then she moves on to continuing to fight for other women's rights and educational rights and reforms and health reforms and things like that. So, you know, she is an impactful person, but probably could have been much more so had her energy been put into legislation as opposed to smashing up a saloon.
Well, and we're coming in so close towards the end, and there's a couple more questions coming in.
But I want to as fast so I can.
I want to make sure we do this one because this one I think is really important. There's a couple people who want to know how can they learn more? Can you recommend any books or resources on this topic?
Absolutely. The number one thing, and this is how we started our research, is Ken Burns does a wonderful documentary called Prohibition. Highly recommend watching that. It's going to give you a brief overview. You're going to hear a lot of the things that I told you. Also, the biggest book I can recommend is called Last Call. It's by a man named Daniel Okrent, Okrent. He was the former editor of the New York Times, and he wrote a comprehensive history on Prohibition called Last Call. Highly recommend that one.
And then real fast, if you can give this one a yes or no, that would be great. Is it true NASCAR had its origins via Prohibition? Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Because they just said, is that just a legend or is that true? But otherwise, we are at 8 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of the time that we said we were going to take for everybody. So, Jonathan, thank you so much. Crew, did you have any final words for Jonathan or our audience?
I enjoyed it, and my wife said we're going to go on a prohibitiontours.com and find one.
Come on out. Come on out, my friend.
Okay. Thanks a lot. We appreciate it. Thanks, Chris.
Of course. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Have a great rest of your evening.